If you're part of a private equity organization or you work for a company that's owned by private equity, there's a high likelihood that you're considering a digital transformation as a way to increase value within your organization. There's a lot of considerations that are very important for private equity related transformations though, and I want to talk about what those things are here today. My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And many of those clients that we work with throughout the world are private equity owned. Private equity has come in and made some sort of investment and have plans to turn around a company or to maximize the value of that organization. And oftentimes digital transformations are a key way to enable that business value. Now, what we found is that digital transformations with private equity groups look a little bit different than your normal digital transformation. So what I want to talk about today are what are those key considerations and things that you should keep in mind throughout your transformation. And just as a side note, as I'm talking through this, I'm taking a very high-level flyover view of what's included in a lot more detail in our private equity playbook, which I've included a link to below. But that private equity playbook has a ton of details and additional best practices beyond what I'll talk about today. But what I want to do today is summarize some of those best practices here today. The first thing to understand in terms of defining a digital transformation strategy and roadmap that makes the most sense for your organization is to make sure you fully understand what the goals and objectives of your organization are. And usually with private equity owned organizations, the goals look different and oftentimes they're more aggressive than the goals of other organizations. And the reason this is so important is because it will heavily influence, or should heavily influence, your overall digital strategy, the types of technologies you might consider, and the way you deploy those technologies. For example, if you're an organization that's trying to scale and you're trying to standardize operations and you've grown through acquisitions over the years, you're going to potentially want to move towards more of a standardized target operating model, which would suggest that you might go look at potential single ERP systems that can help you do that. Or if you're an organization that has a lot of different locations or you operate in different countries and you have a heavily localized strategy, you might find that more of a best of breed, flexible type of technology approach is going to make more sense. And just those two examples, or the contrast between those two examples, point to very different digital strategies, very different technologies and implementation approaches that you'll want to consider. So that's just one example of how you want to define what are the organizational strategies. How fast are you looking to grow? How much do you want to standardize? What is your future state organization going to look like? And really defining those goals at a high level so that your digital transformation aligns with those high level goals. Another thing to consider is what exactly are your technology options? What type of technology or technologies might you be considering as you look to automate and increase business value within your organization? Now, oftentimes organizations that are private equity owned will come in and say, hey, we want to put in a full ERP system to tie together all of our operations. But that's a very vague statement, or that's a very vague need. You have to define in more detail what type of ERP system might you be looking for. Are you looking for maybe a big expensive ERP system that might potentially give you more business value in the long term? Or are you looking to sell this investment in just 1 or 2 or 3 years and you want to get this done as quickly and as inexpensively at as low of a risk as possible? Those are two different profiles of two different types of transformations that you really need to think about and consider as you're going through your transformation. Now, we work with some private equity firms that are thinking longer term about really building value over 5 or 7 or more years. We have other clients with private equity involvement that they're just focused on the next 2 to 3 years. And for the latter, those ones that are focused in the shorter term, they don't want to take on typically a high degree of cost or risk to implement new technologies. So you really want to understand what your options are within each of those extremes, and certainly you might fall somewhere in the middle, and really understand objectively what are the best options out there. You might be looking at ERP systems, you might be looking at customer relationship management technologies or HR technologies, supply chain management technologies. There's a whole host of different types of technologies out there. And for more information on this, I've actually also included a link to our digital transformation report, which gives you an overview of different types of technologies out there, as well as rankings and ratings of different types of technologies for your enterprise needs. So I encourage you to check out that link below and download that to give you additional best practices and reviews of potential technologies out there. One of the most challenging parts of digital transformations that involve private equity or private equity owned firms is that private equity owned firms just in general tend to move at a faster pace and a more aggressive pace in terms of wanting to grow and achieve business value. So there's a certain amount of impatience that goes along with that, and there's also a certain amount of unrealistic expectation that goes along with that too. So when you're thinking about your digital transformation, the last thing you want to do is cram in a project that's going to take a lot longer or take more money than expected, try to cram that into a box of something that's unrealistic. You want to make sure you have a realistic understanding of what your options are and how long it's really going to take and how much money it's really going to take and what the risk really is. Those are some of the things you want to keep in mind. And so you want to objectively evaluate and take with a grain of salt what software vendors might tell you it's going to take in terms of implementation time and cost. And when we think about what causes implementation failure for any sort of organization, whether it's private equity owned or not, one of the biggest root causes is that unrealistic expectation. If you have unrealistic expectations about what you can or can't get done within a certain amount of time, you're going to make bad decisions later on because you're going to find that those were unrealistic expectations and you've got to cut scope or you've got to cut something out of your overall approach in order to achieve that unrealistic expectation. So that's something to really keep in mind, and this is a higher risk area for private equity owned firms, even more so than other types of organizations. Regardless of how quickly you may want to move and just jump into your transformation, it's important that before you do that, you have a very clear understanding of what your implementation plan and your overall transformation strategy is. So similar to the last point about having realistic expectations, you also want to make sure it's a complete plan and that you're not just looking at this from a technology perspective or a technology implementation perspective. You also want to be looking at how are our business processes going to change? What is that future state operating model? What is our future state organizational model going to look like? How are we going to be organized as we look forward to the next 2, 3, or 5 years? Or in some cases, organizations are trying to consolidate and centralize functions as a way to increase efficiency and increase business value. Those are all things that will drive and dictate how long your overall transformation is going to take. It's more likely that those areas are going to delay or cause a longer implementation timeline or budget than the technology itself. So you really want to have a good handle on the areas outside of technology that are going to be critical to your overall transformation as part of your transformation strategy and plan. Just as you want to have a realistic understanding of what the implementation plan is, what the costs are going to be, and what the overall strategy is going to be, you want to make sure you have a realistic understanding of what's the real business value, what's the ROI out of this. We've probably by this point identified what our costs are and what the overall implementation is going to look like, but what's the business value we expect to get out of this? And that's something in some cases is easier for private equity owned firms because they're usually finance types that think that way inherently about their investments. So that's the good news. The other news is that you want to make sure you actually follow through with that, and that if you're working for an organization that's private equity owned, that you think like a private equity person and look at where the business value is and where the actual measurable business benefits might come. And it's important to view this not just in an academic, overly optimistic perspective, but more from a pragmatic operational perspective of what kind of business value and measurable business benefits can we really hold ourselves accountable to post-implementation. So in other words, as you're building your business case for your investment, it's important to look at this not just as a justification tool, but as a way to measure business benefits post-implementation so that you can make sure that you're holding yourselves accountable, but also that you're optimizing those business benefits over time. So I hope this has given you some things to think about as you begin your digital transformation journey within your private equity owned organization. And for additional information, I've included a few resources in the links below, 2 in particular that I'll direct you to. First one being that due diligence playbook that I mentioned before, the private equity playbook. I've included a link to that, as well as our annual digital transformation report, which includes a number of rankings and ratings of different technologies and digital transformation best practices that are relevant to any sort of organization, especially if you're private equity owned. So I encourage you to check out those 2 resources, as well as some of the others that I've listed below. And if you'd like to chat more about your private equity digital transformation, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to be a sounding board for you as you continue your transformation journey. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.